Chapter 14. Aunt Gertrude answered Frank's question.
Of course that crook was caught. The police came back and nabbed him. Inventor, nothing.
Yeah, Joe shouted. Who is he?
He won't talk, and he has no identification on him, but I'll bet he belongs to Chris's gang, Miss Hardy said.
You're probably right, Frank agreed, and they may all belong to Mars' racket. And after a moment's thought, he added, I think I know a way to find out.
How?
Joe asked. Frank grinned. I'll pretend I'm a fellow gang member and go talk to him. The young detective telephoned Chief Kolig, who gave his consent to the plan. What can you tell me about this man? Frank asked. Hearing that the prisoner was very short and strong, Frank instantly thought of the men the burglars at the right home had been mentioning. Well, it sounds like Shorty, he said. After hanging up, he asked Miss Hardy, Do you have any unmounted diamond?
Yes, one that fell out of a ring. Why?
I'd like to borrow one as sort of an identification with the gang. That's a swell idea, Joe said. I'll help you get fixed up. The boys went upstairs and rummaged through their father's supply of disguises. When Frank emerged from the house, his best friends wouldn't have recognized him. He wore a long-cut wig and beard and tight-fitting slacks and a turtleneck sweater. He roared off on his motorcycle and on purpose went past the cell block. As prearranged, Chief Kolig met him at the entrance to the headquarters and escorted Frank to the prisoner, who looked idly through the bars. There's a friend of yours here to see you, said the chief. Maybe he can persuade you to unbutton your lips. Frank gazed through the bars. Like nothing, I will, he whispered to the prisoner in a tough voice as soon as Kolig had moved off. Hiya, Shorty. I'm sorry the dicks got you, but you didn't tell him anything, did you? Nah. Frank was jubilant. He had scored 1 point. The man's nickname was Shorty. Did you hear my new motorcycle? He asked. Yeah, I heard it, Shorty answered. What'd you pay for it with? Frank pulled the diamond from his pocket. With some of these. Shorty seemed impressed. Say, what's your name? Frank assumed an air of annoyance. Ain't Taffy told you nothing about me? Nah. The young sleuth's heart was thumping with excitement as he said, The name's Youngster. I got a bonus on the last haul. I'd just joined up with Mar. When smacko, I run into the toughest setup. Shorty, apparently convinced by Frank's story, said, I was looking for some chips too, but Mar probably had me rubbed out for getting in here. Did the dicks take Hardy's package from you? Frank asked. Yeah, before I could even open it. How'd you like me to lift it? I could do it easy, Frank boasted. From the dicks? Shorty asked, astonished. Nah, the Hardys. The chief, he gave it back to them. Shorty's thin lips broke into a smile. Well, then, Taffy'll think I didn't bugle after all. His face clouded over, however. Less'n you double-crossed me, that is, he added. I won't squeal, said Frank. I'll tell Mar you gave it to me to deliver. Say, where's he holding up now? I seen him in New York, and he told me to come here and wait till I heard from him. Well, I guess he's still at Bickford's, Shorty answered and added with a smirk. Best place to hide out with a wad of rocks. For a moment, a voice called, Time's up for visitors. A guard came in Frank's direction. All right, but don't rush me, the elated boy said in a tough voice. He swaggered out of the police station and walked towards his motorcycle. What should he do now? Divulge the information to Kolig at once and have the police pick up Taffy Mar? I'll tell him anyways, Frank decided. He can notify Keith. Kolig said that he would stake a plainclothes man at the shop. I'll let you know what happens. When Frank reached home, Aunt Gertrude met him at the door.
"Oh, I'm glad you've come," she said excitedly. "We must do something at once about that young clerk at Bilford's."
"Well, we're going to," her nephew assured her. "That is, the police are."
"Well, I can tell them something," Aunt Gertrude said. "I'm going to tell you what I remember about him."
"You know something about him?" Frank asked.
"I'll say I do. I recall the tall, fair-haired man who bumped into me at the Gresham Railroad station and called me an old whaler. Well, it suddenly come to me that one of the men he was talking to was the very same young man who was working at Bickford's."
"What?" Frank exclaimed. "Are you sure?"
"Now listen here. When I'm sure, I'm sure,"
his aunt said sharply. "Auntie, this is great news!" Frank exclaimed. Her announcement changed the whole scheme of the attack. "Does Joe know about this, and where's he?" Frank asked.
"Well, he hasn't heard my story, because I just remembered Joe went... Oh, here he comes now."
As Joe came in, he said, "Frank, how'd you make out?" "Great. Listen. Taffy Marr, he's working at Bickford's."
"No kidding."
"Yeah. I got the tip from Shorty, the prisoner." "And listen to this," Frank answered. "Aunt Gertrude saw Marr with Chris and Gresham. When I remove my disguise, will you call Chief Colleague and tell him this?" "Okay, let's go down and watch the fun while Marr's being arrested," Joe urged. It took Frank only 5 minutes to take off his costume and makeup, since Miss Hardy and Aunt Gertrude planned to leave the house. Joe put Mr. Wright's invention in the tire well of the boy's car. Then he and Frank rode downtown in the convertible. When they reached Bickford's, there was a good-sized crowd in front of the jewelry store. "What's going on?" Joe asked a bystander. "Oh, I don't know. An attempted hold-up, I guess. Police arrived and circled the building. We've been waiting for them to bring someone out." A siren began to wail, and a second later an ambulance raced up to the store. It stopped in front of the jewelry store, and a hush fell over the crowd as they waited for the victim to be brought out. Would it be Taffy Marr, or a policeman who had gone in to arrest him, or would it be the shop owner? A stretcher was carried in, and a little later brought out bearing a man. His eyes were closed, and his face was ghastly white. "It's Mr. Bickford," Joe exclaimed. Instantly the boys pushed through the crowd and rushed up to an officer just emerging from the store. He knew the Hardys and beckoned to them. "We arrived just a touch too late to catch Marr," he said. "Marr must have attacked Mr. Bickford and cleaned the place out before he skipped." "A complete haul, you mean?" Joe asked. "Took everything." "How bad off is Mr. Bickford?" Frank inquired. The officer shrugged. "He's unconscious, but his pulse is weak." Joe sputtered angrily. "If I get my hands on Marr, I'll... "It's going to be rough tracking him down," Frank predicted. "I'll bet by this time he's wearing a disguise and has already left town." Joe snapped his fingers. "If he owns a suitcase full of disguises, he probably went back to where he's living to pick them up. Officer, you got any idea where he's living?" "No, but our men are questioning people in the neighborhood." As the ambulance pulled away, the boys asked permission to check out the jeweler's shop for a clue to Marr's address. The officer smiled. "Go on ahead. You fellas may manage to pick up a lead before the police check. I'm to stay on duty outside, so take all the time you want." Frank told his brother he was sure Mr. Bickford had some kind of records concerning his assistant. No doubt they would be under an assumed name. "Let's have a look," he said. The boys found a drawer full of papers. Under them was an account book. They read each name listed in the book, and at last came to one with a recent negotiations of payment. "Well, this must be his new clerk," Frank observed. "Ray Stokely, 49 New Street." "That's worth following," Joe said. Frank and Joe briefly told the officer on duty they might have a lead, and dashed off to their car. They soon reached New Street. Most of the old-fashioned houses had rooms for rent signs and windows. Number 49 was a large run-down mansion set far back off from the street. Frank and Joe climbed the high steps and rang the bell. A neatly dressed, middle-aged woman opened the door. "Is Mr. Stokely at home?" Frank inquired.
No, he left. He moved out not 10 minutes ago.
The woman started to close the door, but Frank smiled at her and said, "We think he's the man we're looking for, but we're not sure. Would you mind describing Mr. Stokely for us?" Her description fit for Mar, and Frank nodded. "Well, he's our man. Do you know where he went?" There was no answers for a few seconds, and then the woman asked,
"Who are you? Boy detectives?"
"Yeah," Joe replied promptly, "and Mr. Stokely is wanted by the FBI and police. You'd be doing them a great favor if you could tell us all you know."
"Oh, gracious!" she gasped. "Well, I know very little about Mr. Stokely, but I did hear part of a phone call he made earlier this morning. And he said, 'Then to the airport.' Does that help you?"
"Yes, indeed, thanks," Frank answered as he and Joe raced down the steps. They arrived at the airport in record time, and as they pushed through the terminal lobby, the boys glimpsed the pilot, Cole Weber, looking at the antique craft and waving. "Well, if Mar's wearing a disguise, how would we spot him?" Frank said. Joe was staring at a man with gray hair, mustache, and a beard, and he stood near a counter, talking to a red-haired fella. "Frank, look! That guy with the gray-haired man he looks to be talking. He looks like one of the kidnappers." "You sure?" "Positive. And I'll bet Graybeard is Taffy Mar." The men turned and went out to the field. Frank and Joe followed. The suspect started running towards a small single-engine plane that was ready for takeoff, and they climbed aboard quickly. "Well, now what do we do?" Frank asked. "Only one thing we can do," Joe said. "Follow him." End of chapter 14.